Alright, let's get started. Welcome to the third video in this orchestration series. In our last video, we discussed the overtone series and the large impact it has on orchestrating chords. In this video, we're going to change up the pace a little bit and finally start looking more carefully at the different instruments that actually make up the orchestra. Now, there's a ton of information that we need to cover, and I'm trying to keep these videos a little on the short side, so as we begin looking into each section of the orchestra, I'm going to start spreading out all of the information across multiple videos. For example, in this video, we're going to look at the basic fundamentals of the stringed instruments. We'll discuss how they create their sound, their range, their primary roles, and just some general tips on writing for them. In the next two videos, we'll cover more common playing techniques and traditional orchestration strategies, respectively. Now, with that out of the way, let's dive on in. The string section is the largest section in the entire orchestra. It's not actually all that uncommon to have more than half of the orchestra consist of just string players. It's also the most homogeneous section of the orchestra, which means that each of the instruments sound pretty similar to each other. To put this in context, if you were to hear a string quartet all playing the same note, you'd be pretty hard-pressed to identify one instrument from another unless you were really familiar with their sound. Each instrument shares the same type of tone color, which can be incredibly useful when you're looking to create a seamless wall of sound. But the true strength of the stringed instruments lie in their versatility. Melody, harmony, rhythm, and texture are all fair game and at nearly any dynamic level you could possibly want. Each of these stringed instruments are capable of playing super quietly, all the way to super loudly, and at anywhere in their entire range, which is an ability unique to them and just a handful of instruments from the percussion section. For these reasons, they've remained one of the most frequently used sections throughout the history of the modern orchestra. Now, each of the stringed instruments are built pretty similarly. They consist of 4 strings strung between a neck and a bridge. Each of these strings are tuned to a different fundamental pitch and produce a sound when the musician either draws a bow across the string or plucks it with their fingers to get it to vibrate. String players can manipulate which note is being performed by pressing their finger down on a string, which effectively shortens it and increases the pitch of the note being heard. As they move up higher on a string, the sound produced tends to become more intense and a little more emotional as the percent of the string being used becomes smaller and smaller. We'll cover more on how to use this to your advantage in the next video. For now, if we look at the string section as a whole, we'll notice that it consists of 5 different sections spread across only 4 different instruments. We have the first violin section, the second violin section, the viola section, the cello section, and the bass section. Before we eventually look into how to make the most out of each of these instruments, we first need to understand what they're capable of. So for the remainder of this video, we're going to take a little closer look at each of them, starting with the violin. Now, as I mentioned earlier, most violins consist of 4 strings strung across a neck and a bridge. Each of these strings have fundamental pitches that are tuned a perfect fifth apart from each other. We have G3, D4, A5, and E5. When you're writing sheet music for the violin, you're going to stick to the treble clef unless you start to go beyond 3 ledger lines above it. Then you can use an octave sign to write everything an octave lower and make it a lot easier to read. Now, depending on what you're writing, the violin does have several different recommended pitch ranges that we're working with. The most common range you're likely to work with for the violin is its range as part of a full section of violin players, which spans from a G3 to an E7. That's the G below middle C, all the way up to the E 2 octaves above the treble clef. Things get changed up a little bit when you start working with a solo violinist. In this case, you can work with a little bit more by adding another perfect fifth on top of that range, which gives you a total range of G3 to B8. Now, you might be wondering why there's a difference between the range of a violin section versus a violin soloist. And the simplest explanation for this is that it just becomes more difficult for an entire section of violin players to stay in tune with each other the higher up they go in the instrument's range. You see, violins don't have frets like a guitar, which means that there is a slight difference between the finger position of one violinist playing a note from another violinist playing the exact same note. This doesn't actually become an issue until you start playing higher up in the range, because up until then, the differences are so tiny that the sheer number of players performing together and the homogeneous nature of their instruments help to hide any of the inconsistencies and make it sound pretty much perfectly in tune. However, since the space between notes on the neck becomes smaller and smaller the higher up on the string you travel, individual differences in things like finger size or experience level begin to factor in and increase the differences between each player's finger position until the whole section just sounds out of tune. You can get away with having a soloist perform this high because they have no other instruments to compare their sound to. They're playing solo, and thus the audience is much less likely to notice that they're slightly out of tune. Interestingly enough, this actually has another implication for writing for stringed instruments as well. So typically, if you ever find yourself in the position where you're writing for only two instruments of the same family, for example, two violins, two violas, two cellos, or even two basses, you want to make sure that you write separate parts for each of them. Because for whatever reason, the human ear just tends to get more picky when there's only two of them. Your audience will be much more likely to notice that they're slightly out of tune with each other if they're playing the same part. Oddly enough, this rule seems to be specific to the number 2. Because the moment you've got 3 players or more, the human ear just seems to phone it in and no longer notice the difference in their intonation, just as long as it's not really bad. So getting back to the topic of the violin's range, we have one more that we need to consider, which is the violin's range when playing pizzicato, or when the player is plucking the string instead of bowing it. In this case, the total range is an entire octave shorter than that of the section. It only spans from G3 to E6, since anything higher than that doesn't really last long enough to be of any use to us. Now, fortunately for us, none of the other stringed instruments we'll be covering have this many different ranges to consider, since most of them are either sufficiently large enough or not used traditionally in so many ways that we'd have to worry about assigning additional ranges to them. So the last thing I'll say about the violin is that it, like all the other stringed instruments, is an excellent choice for presenting melodic material. You see, anywhere in the violin's range is fair game when you want to present a melody, with the one caveat being that anything played above the staff, so anything like E5 or higher, easily has enough power to be heard cutting through a full orchestra playing loudly together. While anything on the staff, or anything lower than E5, tends to have a little less carry power and work better with quieter, more intimate settings. The reason for this is actually two-part. Number one is simply that higher pitches carry farther than lower pitches. Number two has to do with the idea of tension in strings that I mentioned earlier. Anything above E5 is typically played on the highest string, which requires the player to move higher up on the string to produce higher notes, unlike the lower strings, which can simply move up to a different string when moving up in pitch. As I mentioned earlier, the higher up a string performer moves, the more tension is added to the sound, which contributes to additional intensity and emotion to the tone color, which provides greater carrying power. And with that, we've discussed pretty much everything I wanted to cover with the violin in this video. So next up on our list is the viola. The viola looks like a slightly larger violin and shares much of the same range, playing anywhere from a C3 to an A7, which is the C an octave lower than the middle C, all the way up to an A that's a bit higher than an octave above the treble clef. And just like the violin, the viola's 4 strings each have fundamental pitches that are tuned a perfect fifth apart from each other. There's C3, G3, D4, and A5. Now, unlike the violin, the viola's music is written predominantly in the alto clef, where middle C is literally in the middle of the staff. However, if you start to write notes 3 ledger lines or higher above the staff, you can switch to the treble clef. So the viola often gets a pretty bad rep. It's frequently the butt of jokes and a bunch of memes online, but honestly, it really does have an incredibly beautiful sound. Its lower registers bring a really deep, chocolatey, rich tone color that can't be replicated by the other stringed instruments, which makes it ideal for solos, melodies, or countermelodies. And speaking of melodies, just like the violin, performing the melody is fair game anywhere in the viola's range. However, there are 2 specific parts of its range that you should consider. The first is the very lowest octave of the viola's range, that's C3 to C4, or the C an octave below middle C all the way up to middle C. This is the most idiomatic and instantly recognizable portion of the instrument's range. It shares this range with both the violin and the cello, which are more commonly used to present melodic material, but neither of them can match the rich tone color of the viola in this particular register, which is why, on the rare occasion that you're looking to write a melody in this range, you should really consider using the viola. The second most suitable range for the viola to play melodic material is anywhere from C5 and above, since this is where the viola will have the most carry power and have the easiest time being heard. This also includes the viola's highest register, which allows you to take advantage of the higher tensions being used on the A string. With that being said, however, no matter where you put the melody in the viola's range, it will require careful orchestration. Because just to speak bluntly, the viola has a pretty big disadvantage for performing melodies due to its range. It's neither in the bass nor is it in the soprano. It's kind of in the middle. And this means it doesn't have the advantage of sticking out on its own, and is going to require careful attention to your differentiation in order to make sure it remains in the foreground. But don't let this dissuade you from using it, because the viola really is a very beautiful instrument and deserves a far more frequent use than it currently gets. So next up, we're going to discuss the cello. Next to the violin, the cello is probably one of the most frequently used melodic voices in the string section. It has 4 strings, which are each tuned a perfect fifth apart from each other, and each, coincidentally, are an octave lower than the viola's strings. We have C2, G2, D3, and A4. It has a pretty impressive range of C2, or the C 2 octaves below middle C, all the way up to G5, or the G at the top of the treble clef. So in other words, it pretty much has command of the entire bass and treble clef. Unlike the violin and viola, the clefs used by the cello are a little more complicated. And typically anything written between C2 and E4 is going to be written on a bass clef, which is the most frequently used clef when writing for the cello. Anything written between E4 to B5 is typically going to be written on the tenor clef. And then finally, anything written from a C5 to G5 is typically going to be written on a treble clef. Now, the cool thing about the cello is that it seems to almost embody the versatility that the string section is known for. It has the ability to play nearly any role in the orchestra. Its lower registers are rich and powerful, which makes it an ideal voice for the bass line, but its upper registers are expressive and emotional, which make it an ideal candidate for melodies or harmonies. Traditionally, anything from E4 and above is considered idiomatic for cello melodies. But really, you can use anywhere in the range you'd like. Just know that anything lower than E4 is going to require careful differentiation in order to remain in the foreground, since lower notes tend to be at a disadvantage compared to higher notes when it comes to demanding attention from the audience. Finally, let's briefly look at the double bass, which is also known as the contrabass, or just simply the bass. The double bass has a staggeringly low range that stretches all the way from a C1 to a B flat 4. This gives it a coveted and important role as one of the true basses of the full orchestra. However, it's also the only transcribing instrument in the string section, which means that the pitches you hear are not going to be the pitches that you write down in the sheet music. When scoring for the bass, all of the notes you write are going to be raised an octave. This means that although the bass has a sounding range of C1 to B flat 4, it's going to have a written pitch that spans C2 to B flat 5. This is simply just to help the music be more legible, by avoiding an entire octave worth of ledger lines that go below the staff. Also, when you're writing for the bass, the most commonly used clef is dun-da-da-dun, the bass clef, surprise, surprise. However, if you're going to spend any lengthy amount of time 3 ledger lines or higher above the staff, you can switch to either the tenor or the treble clef, depending on what the preferences of your players are. The double bass has 4 strings that are tuned a perfect fourth apart from each other, at E1, A2, D2, and G2. And no, that wasn't a mistake. The bass's lowest string is tuned to an E1, but most modern basses also have an extension that allows them to play lower by a major third, which brings them down to a C1. In terms of performing melodies, the double bass doesn't actually do that very frequently. Typically, it's going to stick to performing the bass line, or foundational harmonies. However, on rare occasions, it can double with other bass voices in the orchestra, like the contrabassoon and tuba, with the cello and bassoon performing an octave higher. And this creates a really cool, almost room-shakingly low and powerful effect when used sparingly. All right, and that is the end of another video. Hopefully now you have a little bit of a better understanding of the individual instruments in the string section than you did before the video. There's still a lot that we need to cover, but I really think it's very important to start with a nice, strong foundation in the basics. In our next video, we're going to cover common playing techniques, things like pizzicato, collegno, flautando, things like that you often see in sound libraries. We're going to talk about how they're used by the players, and more importantly, how you can use them realistically in your own music. On another note, I want to say thank you. We just passed 400 subscribers, which is just crazy to me. All right, so thank you so much for your support. It really means a lot to me. I'm really going to try and crank these videos out at least one a week. It takes me a long time to figure out what I want to say in each video and how I want to say it. And work schedule's pretty crazy, but my goal is one video every week. And on the odd chance, like, I know this one's late. I know it is. I'm sorry. There's going to be times when well, basically, I want to do it once every week. If I can't, I'm going to try at the very latest to do one every 2 weeks. And I'll try to keep everybody updated on when new episodes are coming out. But for now, just keep up the hard work, all right? Keep on studying, keep working, and keep making new music, all right? It's one of the greatest things we can do in life, at least in my experience.